6-minute warning. We got the email chain already and we're close to starting.
I'm about to send it out, yeah.
There are still 2 minutes, correct?
Yeah. I just want to make sure we're going to be on time.
Okay, the doc should have been sent out. Okay, is everyone ready?
Holy fuck.
Okay, Rennie, Michaela, Chris,
Yeah.
cool. And then Nina, y'all are good? Okay, cool. I see hands have been moved, so I'm gonna draw some thumbs up. All right. It. And everyone can hear us, okay, yeah? Okay. Niggas getting vaccinated in the 2020s. Niggas are vibing in the 2020s. It's been a long time coming. And now niggas are manifesting for a better 2021. Niggas was protesting in the 2020s. Niggas was surviving in the 2020s. Or we were trying anyway. But everyone changed the channel. Fox 4 decided once again Black lives didn't matter. All the black squares returned their documentation of white bar trips and vacations. A nigga is still tired. Asia, where's your energy? The team needs you. The topic needs you.
Historical erasure is an act of anti-black violence. Ram and 20 erasure is used from a white from a CIO's literature. Erasure can really ideally to replicate the white historical superstructure. Historical erasure is a form of structural violence, and it is critical to recognize to reduce our commitment to the ideational vision of the alliance and to recognize it is built on a history of anti-blackness. Folks, and 20 nations are matching you research quote whose binds matching community together. America like who's not fiction. America see in the hill, rather is by intact anti-black racism that holds structure there practice including in America. This anti-black racism is long history found in the matrix of gender violence of the African slave trade, but anti-black racism was not an American feature alone. Racial slavery and colonialism were parts of the global system. The anti-black racism of European colonial powers to improve racial theories developed in American black body souls or surplus, which cannot be fully included by political common sense, constructed by the historical understanding that science maintains about itself. We are historical beings to make sense of ourselves through memories of the past. America is unwilling to confront the fact that that was a safe society in the practice of settler colonialism. We have on indigenous populations in conjunction with Europe's unwillingness to confront its own history of colonial violence and provides a dominant common sense for structures the present into the history of erasure remain visible as violence history goes to the present is continuing to describe confrontation with our history marks significant encounters involved move to both confront and tear down the everyday monumentalization of historical and back violence in American continental Europe. And we analyze the resolution by examining all that surrounds the resolution. In the wake, slavery is not a historical event that has passed in time, but an ongoing process that shapes the daily existence of Black Americans, Sharp 16. To be any way to talk about the continuous taking president of slavery as yet unresolved unfolding the use of like understanding how slavery is bound to merge with contemporary conditions, spatially excitement to other dimension black non-being as well as modes of black ones of resistance to slavery resistance initiative building black America is not because of man constitution but black on days to perfect children because black lives are still imperiled and divided by a diversion of school in particular trend centuries ago. This afterlife property slavery being turned nothing preservation impoverishment living wage slavery living afterlife of property the inherent non-status ever appearing now the Americanization of black women children living wage means living in history and president terror from slavery the president with the ground for everyday black citizens living wage means living in what terror and what to pass for the public about terror, black people become the carriers of terror. Those are white little magics like feel temporarily bad. Other black suffering never lose no whatever they can replicate based on know that as black person you can be killed for simply being black, no hands in your pockets, no playing music, no sudden movements, no driving your car, no walking at night, no walking the day, no turning on the street, no running this building, no sitting your ground, no sitting here, no sitting there, no talking back, no playing with toy guns, no living while black to be in the way to live in those the law is not bound to respect. And the economic and political power of the members of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization were built on the bodies of African slaves. The transatlantic slave trade trafficked 10 to 15 million souls across the North Atlantic, and more than 2 million died in transit, their bodies disposed of in the wake of the slave ships. Yet, despite being founded on a legacy of violence and anti-blackness, the United States commitments with NATO were built on an ideational vision of an alternative history that whitewashed the memory of the alliance and presented itself as a model of liberal and ethical states. Whereas in 19 this community, the nation turned itself as the free world, the Atlantic allies, self-turns as the free world as an ideological contract built on certain aspects of the past to focus on the transatlantic community built on the ideas of Western civilization represents one transatlantic history and excludes others. There's an extra NATO as a political military community and the broader ideational community assumption statement that NATO is something more than military and defense alliance. It's not the exclusive embodiment of the Atlantic community, but it is a best known vehicle native members of the Naval establishment institutions built on a common history identity because of a shared civilization and values. And the desire to leave the past behind perpetuates everyday violence. Well, in 19 charges of racism, frequently by the response get over people who are dwelling in the racist past, racialization was on forgetting your spell and leaving behind the very process of to surrender whiteness and right bodies that temporarily present, even futural in their orientation, freedom messages of racist history, free to adopt any number of stances, expectations to get over racism or dangerous in their denial of racism. This very gesture serves to redescribe differential racialized temporalities and debate itself as an anti-black institution that seeks to discipline black argument within the whole through forced conformity to literal language as an act of gratuitous violence. Our reading of the resolution is an undisciplined commitment to abiding in the wake. Sharp in 16, those of us who think about slavery and sacrifice can be sounds as a ruptures in history, the methods available to us forced to right account. We know that it's our knowledge of slavery and black being in slavery. We're expected to discard those ways of knowing and advertising about we know the violence against ourselves for black academics who live working becoming insecurity as response to the draft in the service of large destructive force, the right and balance our capacity to fear discipline and think along lines of race, annihilation, become criminal discipline. The work we do requires new modes of methods, plotting, mapping, and collecting the archives of everyday of black imminent death, and attracting ways we resist, rupture, and disrupt that imminence, and how we imagine ways of knowing that past.
The act is an act of historical recuperation without reification. Anti-blackness permeates every aspect of our lives. Just because you weren't in the hole doesn't mean you don't have a relationship to it. Time to recognize.
That's Sexton and 6. And the constant deliberations of national security, policing the color lines require no credible threat, no proven stockpile levels of chemical agents or radioactive material, no particular domestic or international law. It only requires the presence of so-called problem peoples, as well as the absence of human presence of transatlantic religious slavery, whose political and economic relations constitute the social fabric of Western modernity in general, but on second utility, the running black is the object of dispossession par excellence of accumulation, predictable commodity capital flesh structure, delicate historical liberation of modern conception of sovereignty, the now downing political and legal discourse globally by the crucial frames of intelligibility for both imperialism and anti-imperialism, empire and its content with blacks by definition of the very notion of the sovereign does not represent the spots of slavery have the exclusive positive capacity about sovereignty to realize the importance of rationalize its violation or to struggle in its defense to name and implement its loss to wage war for its recovery. And the anarchic potential of speculative refusal and our nihilistic optimism disrupts from within captivity. A black anarchy that precedes any material action as refusal is the first step creating paths to endurance. Hartman in 18, asked whether they had been what they intended to destroy implementing the scientific revolution, who would call property law and social order crisis discovery doesn't want themselves transform them from inmates of fugitives, slang for calculation, counter social disorder, only for any medical differences with the previous skills of captivity escape the confines of the prison, even if their bodies did not, that their refusal became music, the anarchy, color, those reasons, and mass recorded confront the prison authorities to become something greater than their house, where they to make claim the refusal to be governed, dangerous because black life was unleashed from within the space of captivity, creative reservoir living within the prison, and that they channeled the fears and hopes of children stolen away by white men and lost at sea. And the act excavates the oppressive history of the member states of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, the resolution and debate itself. Our advocacy marks a historical and a grammatical annotation on the history of alliances, and exposing and marking the silence history of the North Atlantic is essential, true low, and to a central task to bring public consciousness to flows that shape the world of North Atlantic universal mechanisms of silence, making it here less relevant than they are. The silence and capacity here is not only when it's said, but also in how it is said. North Atlantic universals deny the history of motion, North Atlantic universals always suggest a current state of affairs, what is good, what is just, ability to protect transnational relevance while hiding the manipulators of the marks in order to make North Atlantic universals seductive to use. The seduction of North Atlantic universals has to do with their power to silence their own history, and then we need to unearth those silences. A critical assessment of modernity must start with the revelation of its hidden faces.
To be black in the 2020s is to be black in a pandemic. To be black in the 2020s is to be socially dead. Distant, socially distant. To be black in the 2020s is to still be mourning Gianna and Brianna, to be mourning George and Ahmad, mourning all the time that we've lost. Is to be in the thick of wanting to be anywhere other than where we are. To be black in the 2020s, shit, just to be black, is to be forgotten, erased. Wait, if these are the 2020s, the fuck you mean few subjects are as timely and controversial as American alliances?
Our project is essential to affirm black life both in and outside of debate through anagrammatical resistance. Kelsey, in 19, naming the production of anagrammatical blackness to the ongoing which is being captured and shipped that reduces blackness to the body to flesh the degree of social conceptualization does not escape the one of the Russian discourse. Such proposition returns blackness and blackness to the analysis of what grounds debate's impossibility. What would it mean to think debate is a practice of the impossible? To think the black debate is jurisdiction of black social life. We need to rethink the chair's terms of rhetoric itself. We might think debate not as dialect, both precedes and proceeds from states, but as the refusal of the call to order the platform to life, even as form is placed under erasure from. We might think to sketch other visions and deactivate rhetoric's ontologies and premises to hold for a moment in the hold in the wake, not grounded, but oceanic movement decay in life, or even dead things become something else. And studying debate's impossibility, we might theorize at the end of the world as a practice oriented toward its abolition, and recognizing the presence of the history of the slave trade and ongoing anti-black violence is an essential survival strategy. Benzio in 21, the rupture from the grand narrative history exceed the temporalities of your Western past. I found myself sitting here with history and passion for writing a ball in a world that has only produced more precarity on black life in the past 12 months to contend with the infrastructure of the world in which black people are made most vulnerable to death, dealing technology, state power to be in the wake of its account of broadcast blackness. What happens to young black women hanging down for net? Another ship's neck. What happens to black people surviving state sanction deprivation aftermath of Hurricane Katrina? What happens to black migrants confined with camps through collides for religious contempt? What happens to the black mother and fortune spending the left to die, go in the middle of the Mediterranean Sea? The geohistory are marked by the mathematics of racial capitalism and the oceanic journeys that have dispersed black people all over the world. This is what we know about those Africans throwing jumped down overboard. They are still with us at the time of the wake and forming wake where we headed those graveyards. There's beauty here. There's desire too. This is loving our flesh over and over against the world in which it is not love. This is black life in the wake.
Are you good?
Yeah.
And y'all can hear me fine from down here.
Yeah, you're good.
Okay. My first question is, what does it mean for the wake or for slavery to be an ongoing process in the present instead of a historical event that has passed in time?
Yeah, sure. So I think that the argument that's being made there is that there are a lot of ways in which slavery and its erasure, or the assertion that was in the past, right? Comments like, we ended slavery a long time ago, or, like, why are people so concerned with racism? Those sort of, like, for lack of a better term, like pleasantries, or those sort of like erasive statements, ignore the ways in which it sort of influences the way that Black people relate to a lot of different things, different structures, different people, etc.
Sure.
Right? The way that
There's a
influences
difference
structures
between-
and how they see Black people.
There's a difference between saying that slavery was a historical event that has influenced the present and saying it is not a historical event that passed in time, but rather is the present. So what does it mean for it to be the present?
So I think in terms of language and what the argument is saying, we do think that that is our argument, right? To say that it is not a historical event that is
Okay.
over, but rather it does constantly influence the way that people relate to one another, et cetera.
Okay. There's a part in the 1AC Asia where you read the tag, it's time to recognize the relationship to the wake. Who should be recognizing their relationship to the wake?
Right, sure. So the sort of assertion, right, that there's only a few people that need to recognize their relationship goes back to the previous question, which is to say that everyone has a relationship to anti-Blackness, et cetera. Our argument is that even if you or your lineage, et cetera, were not in the hold, right, there is a relationship that we all have and must think about in terms of how we relate to Black people and relate to what the whole sort of resulted in terms of, again, how Black people are situated in society, debate, et cetera.
I want to ask a couple more questions about the critiques of debate and debate in the 1AC. Debate is, quote, an anti-Black institution that disciplines Black argument. Does it discipline only through like TUSFG style arguments or through other arguments as well?
Yeah, there are a lot of examples of the way that disciplining of like Black performance exists, right? In terms of just like the way that Black people dress, the way that we sound, the way that we could be seen as more aggressive, et cetera, right? The way that certain TAP people always show up in rounds with Black people in them to say that we need the debate to start on time, but those rarely often happen to Nate or Graham, for example, right? The way that Black people are treated, it's more than just T. Not to say that that is not also implicated in it, because there is a history there of that is also erased. But it is a lot of different things, not just what happens in a particular debate or exchange between an app and a neg.
Okay, fine. Final question. If we don't read a topicality argument, can we have the ballots?
What?
If we do not introduce a topicality argument, can we have the ballots?
Can you have the ballots? What do you mean have them?
Like win the debate, all three of them.
Can you?
No.
No?
No. Okay.
It's 3 off case. Does everybody have it?
I need a minute.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, my computer's being really slow, so.
Okay.
Give me 1 second still. Yeah, I think I'm cool.
Everybody else good?
Nope, not quite.
Okay.
I'm good whenever everyone else is.
Sweet. First off is the critique capitalism makes environmental degradation inevitable. Its mandates in 17 ever spending the economy damages and exponentially increasing pressure on the environmental system that carry use balance safe operating space on the planet, the depletion of forests and fisheries, ocean pollution, the climate change growth, and which was extracting the waste polluting the environmental unraveling the outline of a social innovation that poses society growth is really and the recommendation can be dismissed until the reality of the decade that we're living in low growth world when you dismiss it's impossible. There is a reason to expect the algebraic growth to continue warming, causes global violence and cements injustice towards marginalized populations worldwide. The tall and 14 wall is not my intention to contribute to crisis mentality. The urgency and climate change cannot be overstated. Reliance on fossil fuels continues to support consumptive elites and alter the climate and ways that threaten the existence of humans and other species. Melting out ocean acidification, other impacts are connected with the food shortages, water availability, species extinction, drought, and violent conflicts where people have been most harmed by climate change, but the least responsible. Climate change in the case is also developing the global inequality, exacerbates inequality. The climate cases that were questioned about global injustice with a radical queer feminist critique can be concerned. One concern we cannot overlook at the question in which we is a response to the futures from the present action, the inaction bringing the existence and harm of the climate cases reality disproportionately experienced by women and people of color and disabled and poor people. Now, pessimism excurs class relations and encourages reactionary separatist separatism, metaphysical explanation, strip agency, and discourage collective organizing as hater and 18 black exceptionalism have a diminishing fascism to Afro-pessimism, the symptoms of proliferation, the terms action black is the place of racism, the latter and what the intervention struggle of unified by anti-black and ontologize the separatist perspective of rejecting coalition, the base of the dubious interpretation, the historical piece of it, slavery fundamental social deficits that achieve fears and slavery reproduction, the white supremacy within cotton, sugar, rice, and tobacco, and Afro-pessimists, was reproduced that makes the London to right the black leaders, castigated for the coalition of that obscure class position, the individual board, the convenient position, and performance marginality, the separatist ideology prevents constructive unity that actually will commercialization leading to the trauma consolidate and the victims now by the Asian bodies and for actual people, slavers, and raised by director bodies and metaphysical examination of obscure social relations, the state Afro-pessimism ensures as an ideological well, also the bureaucracies and the radical rhetoric of separatism, reformism, converted before foreclosed possibility of building a mass movement in liberal structures or artificially separated from races, aggressive to movement against racism and online mind that very language of anti-racism. Now capitalism is the root cause of the case. Race was invented as the catalyst so division between the white American workers and their African substance hater in 18th century social record of dimensions white supremacy, race reform, the transition of capitalism, resist temptation, explains everything, rights, it gets an increase from an African non-established racial ideology of the first Africans in Virginia in 1916, 1919, where indentured servancy, same legal category to Europeans, almost property, land, and servants before the 18th century ruling the slave trade, the definition of whiteness and blackness not exist in the 1620s, the force of liberty, the initially European that did not rely on European leader because they were voluntary migration to make into love of rebellion, the insurgency, alliance of Europeans and African laborers were the actions of the ruling class. You can see a watcher move in the ruling class after the labor decisively toward the slave. It fortified wages is the legal category. The Euro-American planetary class entered bargaining with the liberating class. They exchanged proposal privilege. The super exploited African male forced the virtual alliance with the best defense against the possibility of Euro-American African Americans working as outclass alliance. The Euro-American ruling class of the advanced ideology, the inferiority of Africans, rationalized the forced labor net had to incorporate an European population in the category of white, race, Italians, Eastern Europeans, Jews, and Irish. Their politics of angelized macro practices fractures the necessary political compensation required to overthrow capitalism. That's the infecting capitalist states after they have an assistant anchored in institutional law policy, facilitating egalitarian political intervention, depends on the season to insist on horrible policies, force and single market policies, identification. The system set upon the dispersing energies of it, but effectively constantly question the strategy displays given implementing the sake of politics and human execution, given rationalized, racialized violence, and organized politically prosperity, the daunting one of the rest of our resorts to self-gather is easy to catalog difference and build up the extra power. It is easier to go along with individual energy and choices to look after ourselves and to put ourselves in the book and show the power without an alternative. No alternative. The alternative is to endorse a global anti-capitalist movement, and 20 B fails to pay out entrenched evils and animated militarism and refugee and American ways populist backwards movements right for the labor unrest is growing the reading class of revolutionary city within the new global and left enjoys a multitude of emerging movements over diversity and interconnectivity and the ability to achieve meaningful change with the common agenda. We are to make the transition we need agreement after all the left is what the force and treaty to centrality political economy injures through class race essentially save our balance in a way we can actually address discrimination with giving urgent attention to the class that recklessness of the financial factors of ripple effect generate global environmental crisis building up the global weapon transition requires global political organization to do the transition work. We will develop a plan for structural change and national global levels of an organization to practice democratic decision making, clear effects, and alternative system production, international relations, tax office, topic,ality, interpretation, the affirmative should defend a topical plan, and advocacy, the United States federal government should reduce its alliance commitments by at least limited conditions in which one or more of its defense may be activated. The United States federal government means that the three branches to OECD and 87 the U.S. federal republic, the federal government is composed of three branches, the executive and the judicial. Now, alliance commitments are formal promises to intervene in a conflict against aggression by a non-member. That's a partner in one alliance is committed defined as a formal association that states bound by commitment to use force against a non-member. The alliance is also committed for participating states to use force against an aggressor vote, neg limited predictable status, when generates effective contestation, engaging in cease-long process of research, competitive argumentation, refinement is best, achieving the negative is reasonably prepared for the ass arguments when the app is concretely try to stable advocacy, two impacts first competition, the neg on average to win 50% of the time, our interpretation maximizing competitive activity, which is inherent value because it separates debate from other activities and academia. Second clash, regardless of the content we find most engaging or the most interesting or valuable debates, comparative advantages where we gain when unique crosses, argumentative engagement, refinement, and improve our research advocacy and negation. Next off is the NATO counterplan text. The United States federal government should inform the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that the United States will continue to uphold its collective defense obligations under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty if and only if the member states of NATO implement radical reductions and restrictions on border crossing, immigration, asylum, and refugee acceptance. The counterplan leverages U.S. participation in NATO to shape migration policies key to reverse current violent and securitized approaches to migration. That's 17. Trump's refusal to affirm collective defense came into the context of the hardline NATO to the migration in the U.S. Trump helped alliance to the counter migration in Europe and North America. European governments continue to reduce migratory flows by welcome such an approach. The fair show will give the U.S. a strong base. The whole operation conclude with the disproportion in which the U.S. holds NATO. Trump priorities would like to dominate agenda for the securitization of migration with the criminalization of migrant policy. Human supplemental approach to recalls that acknowledge the inevitability of mobility will succeed. Voting negative adopts a new frame of protecting people, not borders. It contests violent control of migration globally, including violence done by North Africa by Europe. That's Anderson 19. The brutal border security systematic unidentified camps in Greece and Polish migrants and health lobby at the EU and U.S. doubled on the Libya's detention centers that have been supported by the EU, pushing people back in the detention. Even following NATO's campaign on the migration policies possible in Europe and elsewhere. The EU, working the AU on a free movement across the continent. They must ensure member states don't feel abuse such as Libya well before NATO as members can be envisioned somewhere at the US and Mexico border can be just by representing US complicity and instability. For policy shift for self attention, the progressive force must not figure they propose another frame blocking people, not border citizens. Must start making the case. The history of Wake is unstable ground. They build a politics of present. The continuity, the continuity of framework denies political agency. The best in 20 passes the truth in that time path of price of the president. The cyber specifically by the universal way what form the political agency take away the UFD continuity provides the thesis that most African Americans experience or was forged at some point at a support and actually the history work inevitability determines the result of solidarity increase the difficult to articulate the escalation unstable gun-based politics future law attempted to redeem the past. We only a person conductor the projection of the wake in the present robs humans of their capacity for transcendence from the past is Morgan and 16 representatives from social life and not separate the world. They capital in and produces representation on the responsible for considering performing the consequences of protection in general. Hope is written in empirical conception of the present life transcend and possibility of the future stress the capacity for the transcending circumstances that constitute against the notion of past dependency that demands specificity and outlining division that goes after the end use and extrapolation of false the future such as restraint and inspire agents capacity to act on the world by robbing humans capacity for changing from the past. The impact of denial is denial of black agency, phobia, blackness, and oppression. That's quoted in 2000. Social problems, black population, non-human, error, merchants that fail to recognize their humanity, such an error could be believed in something with human beings, raise the question of between past and the future, at the end, from the political as consequence of political nihilism, the given rise to economic process, educational problems, and the questions of the social majority, making it difficult for black people to I don't know what they give them for they cause and accuracy we get discounted all the sense and injustice and consequence in the end. What about the equity black of the failures no plan now is that as oppression human existence are contention that's Gordon 15 people, everything about a human being is people whose common conceptions made them want like generalization and generalizations not reasonable. No words is there a human in one identity what they world is different from any black word the project racism in the world and completely in black not a fate accomplished from the standpoint of 220,000 years or 500 we started 500 people now resisting how they want to be here pessimist and optimist and based on forecast of knowledge but human beings don't have the power knowledge they thought they wanted a human system not a system in the world to talk about laws of physics humanity system can only exist by action to maintain the life of human system is incomplete human being is simply reason people would have to be a system breaking down we need to understand the failure differently failures are setting conditions for a new kind of relation the app is performed a pragmatic orientation to change the world is better than an all or nothing analysis political ontology this kind of 17 pragmatic is oriented to the possibility of change the presentation ontological reality but it's certainly crucial to maintain the even the problems that the presence of creating new concepts than on terms of the properly representing ontological probability in terms of the concrete whether the right to deliver specific political problems there was always something that escaped by an organization and the possibility that wasn't to maintain for micro and macro political gives us a condition for new tactics aimed to properly toward change the ambient and pragmatics are for more expensive than the ancient blocks not reducible to face political ontological position the full scope of political fields existing because the political ontological frame that orients their republic and ancient blocks is practical to no one's all revolutionary now applicable to turns the theorization of policy dynamic you can completely hedge political ontological frame the analytical expansion beyond political ontological frame the time the emphasis on forced migration would fit the world 1,000 times a tiny cost the legacy of slavery does not tell us how to activate it Johnson 19 the use fundamental slavery the devil is not living the cranial features of history the generalities including the constant separate narratives abstractly the way critical historical announcement my regular rich that in our great working class circles that is with the challenge we face on court holding experiences make one of the basis for building viable left opposition.
Okay, why should Black people be responsible for resolving environmental collapse or the excesses of capitalism?
If you want, go ahead.
And it's not that they're responsible for solving it, but everyone is responsible for the consequences of the politics that they advocate for, right? So the 1AC advocates a politics that is actively antithetical to one that would.
I have follow question based on that. If responsible for the consequences of our actions, sure. What is the internal link between like voting AF and environmental collapse? What is the internal link between like Asia's labor being necessary for your global anti-capitalist movement?
So again, our argument is not like Asia should go join a global anti-capitalist movement instead of reading the 1AC, but if we're talking about the types of praxis that we debate and introduce in round and what sort of political strategies we endorse, there are consequences to that.
Okay, well, let's talk about that then, right? Because there's a lot of assertions being made on the case page, right? But none of which address the fact that the app is talking about the necessity of centering historical things that have been erased that result in like incorrect action or action that is anti-Black or problematic. So I guess I'm confused as to how centering histories that have been erased somehow competes with the ability for organizing towards the political or organizing to stop things like climate change.
So first is I would disagree with the characterization of the 1AC as simply centering erased history. It rather says, and this was the first exchange that we had in CrossX, that these events are not history, they are the present. And that influences our ability to organize because it says that slavery is
Does the alternative have any account of like slavery's effect on the present day or the consequences of that history? Is it possible to like historicize slavery in the world of the
I
alternative?
think this is gonna, of course, I think this is gonna be an important distinction. Like,
What's the distinction between the way that you historicize?
Yeah, nothing the neg has said slavery didn't happen. Slavery didn't influence the present. Obviously, historical events change the way that the present plays out, but rather that a sole focus on that one historical event as a guiding feature for a present politics is the wrong way to think about it. It's not the most important proximate cause of things like crises, etc.
I just have one more question about the alt, a couple more questions about the alt. What are the accountability mechanisms in place in the movement? Like if someone does something anti-Black, what happens and how do they determine if something is?
So like one important thing that would distinguish the alt from some other problematic anti-capitalist movements is it would not endorse any form of security or bodyguards or anything that is, been problematic and securitizing.
Wait, but you've also said that environmental collapse causes extinction and that we should prioritize that over like.
We did not say that it causes extinction. We said that it exacerbates global inequality and oppression.
You said it. Okay. That's fine.
No, we didn't.
It didn't.
Okay, we stopped at 8:15.
Give me the sim.
Yeah.
Okay. Let me know when everyone gets it. And then if everyone can give me verbal confirmation when they're ready, as opposed to visual, just because I can't see everybody. That would be great. And then I can move it over.
Yep, I'm ready.
Thanks, Chris.
We're both good.
Sweet.
I need 1 second.
You're fine, Ronnie. Also, long time no see, big dog.
I'm good whenever they are.
Okay, thanks, Michaela.
I'm good now too.
Okay, cool. I mean, you're good.
Yeah.
Cool. Society and academia moved to erase slavery along with all the ways in which it shapes black life then now and always the resolution, much like the Western laws, was responsible for its conception, lack of language, or space for black folks to express their relationship to anti-blackness and all the systems that are constantly acting upon it. The idea that few subjects are timely and controversial as American alliances demonstrate that even debate is guilty of erasure. There are two impacts of versus erasure will shape the impact debate, anti-blackness permeates any and everything that niggas do debating alliances are one and the same that they expect unwavering commitment to compliance, giving nothing in return. Debates prioritization of extinction and alliances leave little space for blackness to emerge and hold these systems accountable. The app is an act of recuperation without reification and excavation project from the whole that refuses to be erased. Every iteration of our excavation project is effective in diminishing the cognitive erasure that misprioritizes blackness in this world and creating relationality. That's the conceded true low evidence that fungibility is the second. It's a concept for blackness constantly being acted upon for the maintenance of civil society. The results is exhaustion. The app of the poem at the top of the one see is an impact turn to the resolution's understanding of alliances as being understood as something worthy of attention because the ways in which it requires blackness to constantly prove its ontology and proximity that the app evolves solves the destructive captivity that's Harbin in sharp the ontology debate or the progress stuff. Newsflash blackness ontological theory and scholarship donuts in the subjects and everyday black existence the meaning of slave stuff even though it wasn't economically feasible when impact production of the levels to which plantation lifestyle were treated better than slaves. All are examples of blackness, proximity, death, and ontological positioning. The app doesn't assert that blackness is incapable of change, but rather the political and its foundation upon black labor through death, gratuitous violence, and other forms of anti-black suffering means that it can never be for niggas, but will always call for us to be making more contributions or that our sort of grounds for why we believe certain things to be true are always unstable or insufficient to explain our own subject positioning, which leads me to surrender to blackness. Rooney, Chris, and Michaela, for y'all. Surrender means acknowledging all the ways in which you're indebted to black people in this community, the ways in which their offense exists because of black innovation in this space, and it was created in response to the Louisville Project, etc. It isn't about absolving yourself, but rather about surrendering your right to have an opinion of what model is most fair or what is best for black people, and an assertion ignores the ways in which everyone's relationship to the topic in this space is different. Listen to the sound of my voice, it's the sound of exhaustion, the sound of every pissed off black debater that's been stripped of their creativity, stripped of wins that were rightfully theirs just because the white people didn't get it. The rest of the case, they can be split up into two categories. The first is about the unstableness of our history, the understanding and political agency, etc. We don't rob anyone of any political agency or tell anyone what to do, but rather it's a recognition of the centering of his history is necessary. Nina's characterization, the cross from the 1NC about the way that we talk about history is incorrect. Our argument is about the ways in which, yes, the hold in slavery, etc., in its existence, but NATO's erasure of it necessarily shapes the way that black people are able to evolve and relate to one another, but even the way that you all are able to effectively relate to one another. That's exactly why the Gordon 17 card is literally read in every single debate against a black person who reads any K argument, which leads me to the next part of the stuff about Gordon, etc. For every example they can give for progress or why civil society is better for black people than it was in the past is there's three more examples of rollback of the ways in which it does not address everything perfectly, which begs the question of why people reading pragmatic politics or people who say that reading plans are necessarily good always get to be imperfect because reform can just have one more reform tacked on top of it, but why you all at the end of the debate will expect that the app should have to be perfect and have some sort of pragmatic action. That sort of double standard creates a violent form of exhaustion that always and inevitably pushes black people out of the space, which leads me to lastly to their performativity appealing arguments. So these are incredibly pathologizing and miss the vote, the framework debate, counter-interpretation. We should understand the resolution as a jumping off point rather than an end point. Any other interpretation gatekeeps the potential for accountability in and outside of debate concession of the Kelsey evidence begs the question of control and how it comes to terms with who has what burdens and the implications of those burdens have to maximize the deliberative controls the resolution and centers blackness. It's the net benefit creating the space for black scholars and alternative understandings of different features that move away from Eurocentric universal histories is good because it means that it gets to be better equipped to combat the features always scripted on their bodies. Debate and its relationship to erasure on an academic and interpersonal level also demonstrate it becomes a dissat to their model because it greenlights a world where debate becomes isolated from spaces they advocate on behalf of, which results in blind heroism and lowers the threshold for white debaters in terms of advocacy and justifies the try or die for our model because the squad is only getting worse. The clash debate, their binary's understanding of the rules in debate can never ensure, only ever ensure erasure and ignore the ways in which debate actually operates. They prescribe an idealistic understanding of debate and clash, which will always result in a level 1 preparedness, which turns all of their offense because their intro seems a perfect disclosure. No new policy as competitive, racing to the margins for the most obscure policy advocacy, and K team still reading K arguments on the app, regardless of framework voting. That can never solve their offense because it assumes a version of debate that has never, will never exist, which means you're erasing blackness actually for nothing and their own, other than their own benefit, which is our argument. limit the fairness or competition appeals to fairness, slavery, future blackness and our suffering as a fabric of civil society by creating a burden of exportability that the next model would never have to meet, which is all the stuff I do above about this sort of, it lowers the threshold for accountability and advocacy, which means that you can keep your competitive and fairness. We say that it should be about that, which leads me to the limits and stuff. It leads to a culpability to sad limits. The explosion is inevitable, makes black debaters culpable for an always already expanding topic and justifies a mass exodus of black participants, which also turns all their offense because it begs the question of who the competition they are preserving it for. The capitalism debate, permutation to open analysis of racial capitalism and is weight work. Understanding the histories of the transatlantic slavery is central to understanding racial capitalism. That's Zetterman. And 20, my analysis is inspired by scholars working with the art of afterlives of racial slavery, sharp rather than pitting these perspectives against one another. I seek to engage them simultaneously through the analytic of situated afterlives, the constitutive relationship between the systems of racial hierarchy and the capitalist economic orders, histories of the Atlantic slavery, bringing to the full overview the articulation of race and labor inherent to the modern logistics of the indictment of racial capitalism by the immersing us into racialized depths of hydro history, where writers perform awake work in an analytic. Christian Sharp gives us interrogating the continuous changing of present slavery, yet unresolved and unfolding. And it was founded on the Atlantic slave trade and founded against the Atlantic slave trade to examine the ongoing histories of racial capitalism. The slave trade works symbolically to focus on attention on a constitutive relationship between the systems of racial hierarchy and capitalist economic order. The analytic of situated afterlives helps illuminate the constitutive relationship between racism and capitalism. Paul Sharp's analytic work which draws our attention to the past. It is not the past. Positioning myself analytically in the wake I have endeavored to track of historical antecedents and the racial underpinnings of an industry, the heart of contemporary global capitalism. While we make a mistake to believe that we have left behind the regime that began with the slave trade and forest and plantation and extraction of colonies, that they can also extend the Bentil evidence from the 1AC. The permutation solves best iteration of their links. The permutation solves the best iteration of their links, centering blackness in their race history, provides a necessary context for addressing material gains and self-fragmentation, but it also creates interrelationality that non-parasitically situates people into order to ask the question, what is it that black people do need? Because it acknowledges the true history of fragmentation, etc. Solves that as well, because fragmentation happens as a result of movements pushing out black people for talking about race or acting like good black people for not acting like good black people for the cause. Not reading a plan is not the same thing as rejection of the state. The thesis of the affirmative is the resolution was rejected because of its attempt to return to normal and an erasure that the NATO's history of anti-blackness. That's not an endorsement of the state necessarily, which is all the ontology stuff I do above, but rather a link to an overinterpolation. Just add the opening of space for discussion of erasure equals energy for black people to approach politics in ways that work for them, but that can be anything, but also positions them in a way in order to control the direction of such movements, etc. Their blind affirmation of one party and criminalization of micropolitics, etc. is an impact earned by the erasure impact and results in pathologization. Black people doing things for themselves, not because no one else is doing that, is not micropolitics or immaterial. The link is predicated off of a homogenization, an homogenized understanding of what politics is. The impact debate, there's a performance test. The 1 is an example of performative recognition. The applicant rest of society only attributes value to black life in a term to preserve it or to not make things worse, not make things worse. It should beg the question of how exactly Nina or her partner are in a position to be able to tell you what about black people's lives will be made worse, or how they are even able to measure that, but how you all as white judges are even able to effectively measure and determine that for yourselves, which is why the surrender to blackness argument is so important, because it begs the question of whether white people can truly insert themselves in a space and say that it would be worse for us when you don't know what worse actually would be. Collective responsibility to decide. They also assert a collective responsibility over black people. They assert because black people would die too, or that you know what's better for us, that we are equally responsible for warming, or that we should be equally or invested in the same way about and things like climate change and climate catastrophe, etc. And the climate catastrophe, etc. Awake work is not pessimism. It's not about finding. It's about finding new ways of living in the wake. That's Mittler and 19. But Sharp calls wake work is not simply mourning, rather she writes it is an effort to imagine new ways to live in the wake of slavery and the slavery's afterlife to survive, and more inside those parentheses last possibility, which is all the concession of the app that talks about survival strategies and the necessity of the app, which is the net benefit to the permutation that they simply cannot access the alternative. Black Panthers have their own party because communists were racist when black people do participate in the white communism, they get arrested and tried in court with the whites. That's the Bobby Seale and trial of Chicago 7. Occupy was super right, relatively wealthy, and did such a bunch of sexual violence, isn't explaining to black lines why is LeBron James' house being painted in racial slurs, etc. But also cops don't care about your bank account when they fucking pull the trigger. The counterplan, the U.S. is anti-black, raging wars in its very own geographies and weaponization in its commitments abroad as to why it doesn't need to answer further its enactment of violence at home is what the app is impacting. The assertion that the U.S. gets to determine whether commitments can be upheld in the context of immigration is fucking ridiculous. It's like asking the KKK to decide whether or not they think a hate crime is legitimate or not. There's a conflation. Just have the app from the beginning has publicized their prioritization of scholarship over that is divorced from spaces where those things take place. They going for the scenario relies on a conflation between simply reading their scenario and the ability to actually solve for it. Militarism is an ongoing and daily condition for black and brown Americans and their reception with the external international crises of serious proliferating violence on the home. That's Rodriguez. And a domestic war making seems to be mounting urgency. The primary work of the police force to engage aggressively in internal wars on terror, which entails the commission of urban police forces legislating offenses against criminalized populations and the reshuffling of the relationship between militarized and judicial arms of government to facilitate wars on gangs. Under what conditions are scholars able to militantly oppose American state violence in other parts of the world while tolerating everyday state violence and U.S. policing, criminal law, and genocide? Yeah. And then I'm ready whenever you are.
You good? All right. The 1AC calls debate a fundamentally anti-Black institution. How is it possible to develop Black life within debate rounds?
Okay, yeah, so Nina asked this question in the cross-section of the 1AC. The argument, right, about the way that we understand ontology, et cetera, is also all the arguments that we read on racial capitalism about the way that we understand wage work and what that means to live in the afterlife of slavery. Our argument is that ontology is not about the inability of Black people to create connections and to generate energy or agency for oneself, but rather about the ways in which the political, because of its foundation upon gratuitous violence, et cetera, is unable to actually truly be for Black people because it would be antithetical to the creation of that institution. For example, which is the argument that I made before about for every example of progress that you could give, one, surrender Blackness begs the question of why you get to determine what progress is. And I think a lot of Black people will tell you that there really has not been that much progress made. But even then, right, for every example of progress that you could give, there are 3 more examples after that about why that form of progress was also or resulted in more anti-Blackness or and just became a smokescreen or other fucked up things
about
US
something you
does,
said
which is
earlier.
also probably why the counterplan is fucked up because it just shows.
You were talking about like how this isn't within fundamentally anti-Black institutions elsewhere. Is debate one of those same fundamentally anti-Black institutions? And if so, is that kind of access to Black life possible in other institutions?
It's a really long question. I'm going to need you to rephrase and ask it differently because I don't think I understand the premise of.
Okay. Are in other institutions that are fundamentally anti-Black, is it possible to find Black life?
What do you mean? Is it possible to find Black life? Black life has
a bit unique from other systems insofar as it can, like, it has the potential for Black individuals to create Black life.
Okay, yeah, sure. Like if you're asking me, do Black people exist within anti-Black institutions? Yeah, obviously, like Ben Carson or Candace, whatever. Like those people. I don't think that's what I meant. Okay, well then obviously there are Black people in debate that. Like we think debate is anti-Black. It doesn't mean that Black people can't exist there. That's also like asking, like, can Black people exist in the United States if it is anti-Black? Like,
yeah, I think that okay, I'm gonna move on because I don't think
living in the afterlife of slavery means finding survival and endurance strategies, which is not something that the alternative of the K or the framework debate or model or the counterplan can really answer for, because it doesn't start with the question of what do Black people actually need or centering that discussion of what's been erased.
The counter interpretation, what is a jumping off point? Why is our interpretation an endpoint?
Wait, what?
What is a jumping off point and what is an endpoint in terms of your counter interpretation?
Okay, sure. The counter interpretation is we should understand the resolution as a jumping off point rather than an endpoint. I think in terms that a lot of other policy people use is like the resolution should be like, I don't know, a floor or not a ceiling or something. Our argument is that it is the most realistic interpretation of the way the debate actually operates, because people in debate are going to do what they want to do. So I don't really think that, like, I don't understand how like your model would solve that, but that's what it would mean.
6:24. Oh, you know what? I forget to do the very last thing. I'm starting it again for 1 second. Okay. Okay, it should be sent. It's the K and then the case.
Sorry, what did you say the order was?
The K and then the case. Can I get a thumbs up from everyone? Just want to make sure. Thumbs up, thumbs up. Rooney, you good? Okay. Your ballot affirms political strategies that prioritize anti-capital solutions. A revolution against capitalism requires collective political organizing, movement space, and identity, encapsulate class politics and play into league hands by fracturing the proletariat and pitting individuals against each other. Modern capitalism causes immeasurable structural violence. Not only the alternative is scalable to address accumulation is fundamental to capitalism, which means that bypassing planetary tipping points is inevitable. Climate change, ocean acidification, and then environmental destruction are inevitable that destroy ecosystems that humans depend on. That's McRae in the K outweighs the case one. Racism is disproportionately experienced along class lines. The quotidian experience of people racialized as black is determined by their class, lack of healthcare, education, childcare, and low wages reproduce endemic discrimination. The 1NC also contained a root clause claim that the 2AC does not answer. Second, capitalism ensures climate oppression, which outweighs here on NDT. Notices are certified military place those that those responsible suffer most of capitalist colonies drive those front lines, copy, trash, refive water, misdestruction, cut their food, deforestation, exploitation, my capacity, survive and thrive. Your minorities, the hardest we risk of climate apartheid. Third, alternative racial orders, global capitalism produces climate catastrophe and racial hierarchies beyond white supremacy. It's all 120 global system, race constantly has to stabilize health cross sector, location, shortage, officially hotline insurance, to the dominant superpowers of quality index on phenotypical differences and structure versus structural races might be lesser inside of the white supremacists that could render them more effective even if white supremacy supersedes and human vortex of capital continue to wreak havoc on racialized others in ecosystems and permutation. Do both. One, links come first. A, pessimism. They're not getting out of a link to this. Their Sexton evidence as well as sharp draws on pessimistic and ontological conceptions of blackness. This is the argument for why the wake permeates the present instead of just existing as an event in the past. Pessimism makes class-based solidarity impossible. Capitalists would love nothing more than to convince us that nothing can be done to expand social relations towards building insurgencies because it will always be predetermined and overstructured by its relationship to the Wakeheads hate or B, individualized micro practices. The 1AC says that it is up to individuals to recognize their own personal relationship to the whole rather than analyzing it on a structural level, and describes their method as a personal survivance strategy. The proliferation of self-focused strategies functions as a replacement for politics, precludes the identification of capitalist state as both the source and structural oppression and the locus for fighting it, and disperses the energy that would otherwise be used to organize that steam. C, wake work turns prevents effective resistance to racism because it exclusively turns to the past. Bigger staff 17 wake work theorizes black life in the wake holds does not mean work for black community to be recognized by the risk to defend the D sharp purpose of reckoning and land slavery might preoccupation black struggle makes complicit diminishing black community. Do we build more compelled that call to build moving out critique imagine universe if we hold couple confrontation primary resistance risk neglect direct action. Two, there's no net benefit to the permutation methods incompatible with ours need to be actively excluded. Dean 16 communist policies need to go further. Highlight division organization communism made multiple struggles structures to excite multitude and incompressible struggles replace the antagonism of class polarization flattening the goal becomes a production of securities political future civilians other virtues begins our strength of collectivity. The party offers a political for making process and that the political world left to decide differences, think about pursuing political power, many issues the party, affirm individual autonomy, reasserting capitalist ideology. Third, no permutations and method debates, their choice to forego plan in the 1AC makes competition infinitely harder to garner. They say centering blackness is key. The alternative solves the case alone without the affirmative. It's to endorse a democratic global movement against capital. Labor unrest has grown. The global left enjoys strong support nearing a classic revolutionary situation. That's MAGA ham. The alternative would both engage in democratic socialist reform under the current paradigm of the nation state to provide immediate relief to the excesses of capital like universal healthcare, childcare, campaign finance reform, etc., but would also advocate grassroots linkages between global left movements to build a path for global socialism. Our evidence-based example of revitalizing the world social reform. It solves the case. One, it explains the root cause dropped by the 2AC. Historically, capitalism created the property relationship of slavery in response to a crisis of labor and Bacon's rebellion. The first Africans of Virginia had the same legal status as Europeans. They owned property and indentured servants and sometimes intermarried. After Bacon's rebellion, white elites broke alliances between Africans and working class whites by dehumanizing slaves through the pseudoscience of racial determinism while simultaneously expanding the category of the human to Irish, Italians, and Jews, etc. That's hater B. Contemporary society. It's irrelevant what originally came first between white supremacy and capitalism, because today the capitalist state is the mechanism that sustains both of those logics, and then taking it over to redistribute resources is the most effective strategy. Second, the legacy of slavery does not tell us how to act today. That was the Johnson evidence read on case, working class struggle, and the specific challenges that we face now. The quotidian concerns of Black people today cannot be harkened back totally to slavery, and their attempt to do so occludes future generative forms of organizing. They say the 1AC doesn't reject the state. It's not our link. This is a reductive understanding of politics. The 1AC doesn't need to say we reject the state for their politics to be ineffective, which was all of cross-sex over-interpolation DA and arguments of Black women's energy. One important distinction: excluding the AF does not amount to exclusion of Black women. We are only critiquing certain methods or ways of engaging with the world. Second, politics are everyone's responsibility. Saying you shouldn't be responsible for developing a political program is fatal for emancipation. It turns the case for this is a session with what should be this summer Trump world says it cares what is part of social justice and social left taking the social marginals. You should have to make a case for what more just what are comfortable with opt before is use the way and comfortable face a comfortably precise because of that condition. The powerful may have power only. The action of powerless can remedy that. That's all politics is. As long as society remains a conspiracy to oppress and degrade Black people, there will be people on their stations who recognize only we stop their risks bothers you should build a just and equitable world the way we want to let it is proceed. Should the challenge have confront the world the way it is and challenge it. I have the courage to change it. Third, the alternative is worse. It is an inward self-focused form of me search where only people of a particular group can engage with and operationalize praxis from that group's history. It leads to an impact that turns the app because it kills any possibility of intersectional analysis. For disagreement isn't pathologization or phobia because disagreeing with someone isn't the same thing as saying their praxis is flawed. Five, surrendering to Blackness is another link. It will be answered on the case. We can't base politics off of just identities. What is the endpoint of this? Should we not question Candace Owens's politics? For example, they say performance and collective responsibility arguments. One, links to all of our offense above. We should be able to introduce better strategies to solve oppression or defense. And the clash impact to T will also prove this. But two, this is just another link because viewing contingent affirmations of the self as the equivalent of politics is that symptom of capitalist dominance that I extended reordained evidence above. They say wake work is not pessimism. We're reading link cards to the portions of other parts of the 1EC and how they operationalize wake work. They don't only say endorse wake work as an academic analytic, but describe the 1EC as a survival strategy and say that Blackness has ontological immutable categories. They say the alternative is racist. One, does not assume our alt cross-sex proves the Communist Party can have accountability measures. Second, empirical examples disprove their argument. Interracial unions were empirically effective. Striking dock workers in New Orleans and miners in the West Virginia Coal Wars were able to achieve meaningful solidarity. Third, citing of the Black Panthers or Occupy is not persuasive because it proves how fragmentation empirically hindered efforts to develop solidaristic approaches to overcome capital. Four, Black women socialist organizers have been essential theorists and activists in class struggle, rejecting alliances via class struggle guarantees the destruction of the Black working class. For example, 15 Black women fought against attack of all the sources. Activist socialists bring place centrality class struggles determine future West made Black working class capitalism and gave birth to Black working class. That was to Black boys as foreign ever capitalist savior. We witnessed conservative attacks on the public sector workers, economic crisis, working class women are blown away by police officers. Black working people outside and standing by the loss on critics, Marxism, Marxist studies, Black working class life and cultures need to mark criticism can operate material force, material force as soon as described the masses case. Turn the ass method of residing in the wake is a deterministic reading of history. It projects the failures of the past onto the present, which makes transcendence of present society impossible. A few impacts. One, if their theorization is wrong, their method fails. The wake is not a historical event that the wake as a historical event influence our future, but does not over-determine our relationships to each other and our politics. It is unstable ground to basic politics because it inaccurately implies that all current Black political experience was forged at the nexus point of the wake. Two, that's fast. Two, it denies Black agency, scripts overwhelming path dependency onto the world and actions of Black people, which constrains their politics. That's Morgan. The 2EC answer is insufficient. They're mischaracterizing their own argument because the 1EC does not merely say slavery has created the present. This is something no one can disagree with. But for the 1EC, the wake is, quote, not a historical event that passed in time, but an ongoing process that shapes daily existence. In contrast to historical erasure or historical determinism, embodied by this assertion is bad. It links the past to the present in a way that constrains agency, denies humanity, and prevents us from dealing with contingent political problems like healthcare, housing, education, and police violence. Third, it turns all their impacts and makes recognition of Black humanity more difficult by condemning the future and producing negrophobia. That's Gordon. 4, it turns erasure of the present is still erasure. They paper over that contingency and how it influences Black people. 5, it turns exhaustion, arguments about Black agency. 6, ascribing totalizing absence of progress is just as linear and reductive of the narrative. They're indicting racist discourses on the Blackness, like culture practices and politics, historical slavery, chosen narration is historical facts perceived to define collective facts and not so much historically epistemology narratives as knowledge is debated facts of Blackness create either linear progressive narratives or after-progressive or reverse linear narrative indicating no Black progress has been made. Market, no Black progress has been made. The surrender to Blackness arguments rejected. Their model homogenizes Black politics and relieves white guilt by alleviating white people of responsibility for structural racism both inside and debate and out. So long as they surrender, it cannot operate a liberatory political program. Only tokenizing moves are example about Candace Owens above prove the AF encourages white altruism which trades off with structural challenges to racism. Myerson, AT racism, not individual qualities exist power mediated through acts, dominant conception, emphasize altruism. White people are encouraged to defer, support Black people as peripheral allies. Does not constitute a strategy about this deference woefully. Inadequate response to systemic racism, worse white altruism is a recipe for disaster. Racism is a personal flaw rather than a system of power. Relegating white allyship to the role of surrendering makes it impossible to challenge structural racism beyond the individual. This turns the entire case. Peterson, Smith, and B15 December. The role of allies to shut up and list allies must refer completely limits to struggle interpersonal interactions, downplay structures of power that produce racism. Ironic focus to focus attention on white allies. Distorting factors are understanding racism and how to fight it makes it appear as though racism originates within white individuals. Political action can be reduced to talking about oneself. What is missing is activity and challenging racism beyond oneself. The project as oppression becomes to be a good person. Lost the critique of the oppressive institution. Finally, anti-Blackness is contingent. It is an attempted project to deny Black people their humanity, but will not succeed. They assume what has shaped relations always will. No, the resistance disproves the reading of history because it explains away all Black resistance. Their line that they're trying to walk here is too thin. Blackness incapable of change means reading Gordon is not a microaggression. It is responding to their claims and their sextant evidence about Blackness. And Gordon is just a good author.
You ready, Nate?
No, 1 second.
Okay.
Yep.
Okay, just kidding. I have the wrong piece of paper in front of me. Okay. I want to talk about the stuff that you said about the Black Panther Party and the communist movement, et cetera. Why are those not persuasive?
Well, so the example cited in the 2AC was like the Black Panthers had to go off and create their separate movement. And our argument is not like communist movement of the 60s good and anti-racist, but like that doesn't prove the vitality or the viability of separate strategies, right? Because we have a horribly cemented capitalist system of oppression. And so
I understand that, but the argument that you've made is that those are not persuasive arguments or examples of why the movement would be, or one, why separate movements are good, which I don't know why that's what the app is calling for, but rather it sounds to me like you've placed the blame on the Black Panthers for leaving because it was racist. And it's just like, well, that proves that separating and not just sucking it up, results in more capitalism. Like, I don't understand
that's
how
why
that
I
is not
started the cross-ex with our argument wasn't movement of the 60s perfect. And to some extent, this is a question about like when we start the 1NC cross-ex.
So I guess my question
accountability
becomes like, what does a good movement look like? You said democratic socialism, correct?
Yeah.
Okay, like what is an example of democratic socialism?
Our evidence is the example of revitalizing the world social forum to coordinate global movements against capitalism. So when you say like, what does a good movement look like?
So who's in control of those global movements? Like, what does that look like?
Well, so we started with saying democratic movement. So it would be all of the people that are in control of the movement.
So so you think that that's an accurate instantiation of the way the democracy works? I guess my question then becomes, what is the connection what is the connection between the 3 ballots that are present and voting negative to those movements happening as a result?
So they don't happen. You're correct.
Okay, they don't happen.
Neither does that. So like, this is all the parts of the 2NC where I'm like, it is important what political strategies we introduce and defend. It influences, our praxis.
Okay, that makes sense to me. So you've conceded that those things don't happen as a result. Then later on case, you make an argument about why surrendering to Blackness is bad because it results in sort of tokenization and like alleviates white guilt. I'm confused as to why 3 judges voting for a big global movement and why you profiting off of activism that will not happen as a result of the negative is not the same sort of white alleviation.
Because those cards are extremely specific to this surrender model.
So just your scholarship of white people and Dean, who is also problematic as fuck, is just better than ours?
These are 2 completely different things because those pieces of evidence are speaking to speaking to
You
the active
conceded all
individualized
of part of the
racism.
1AC and the
Because
2AC
it's a
that
question
talks
of
about
whether
the
we should
the
treat,
problematic nature of
because
debate
it's a question of,
resides in the fact
because
that white people are voting for plans, or that the standard for you is just having a good idea with good cards that white people should just over-determine for themselves.
because
But
what
for some reason, there is this perfect standard that I need to abide by because you can't conceptualize it. That's what I'm getting at.
you know what, to be honest, I don't see how the two relate still. And I think these cards are specific to a model of individualizing resistance to racism.
It's the counter plan and then T.
Is there a doc or no?
No, there's no cards. Everybody else good? Okay, sweet. Not going for the counter plan, can see that the counter plan can't solve any of the migration issues. None of their examples can be cross-applied. The first one, the U.S. is anti-black. The USFG being problematic doesn't mean that it's not valuable to debate about it. That will be mostly on topicality. Conflation, the conflation dissent will also be debated on topicality. We don't ignore the way the debates are actually happening in the real world. Going for the next argument, going for a strategy doesn't mean that we solve it. The 2 and C was 9 minutes of why that's a bad model of debate. The militarism ongoing card might be true, but it just proves the necessity for debate or revolution. Topicality. Our interpretation is the AF must defend a topical plan of the resolution. It channels competitive incentives effectively by encouraging clear link on stable competition standards and predictable literature. The topic defending USFG action is the only consistent guide for research that is accessible to all teams in free tournament preparation. Any deviation from advocating it in entirely obvious negative ground and unpredictable and disunified ways. 2 impacts. First, competition and competitive incentive make debate unique from other academia. An unfair game is pointless because the relationship between preparation and success is what motivates research. We are all sacrificing time to be here. Our investment in this activity matters, but the time and energy we have here is finite. COVID is mentally and physically draining, so reject interpretations that overstretch the negative research burden because they cause burnout and this investment. Our impact logically outweighs because the only one that can be solved by voting a certain way and turns their offense because it's the only way to maximize engagement that we have with the 1AC. Second is clash, doing the labor of the negative trace. It teaches us process-based skills of research, argumentative refinement, advocacy, and self-reflection in the world of distorted information, the ability to comparatively evaluate a course of action, conduct targeted research, and argue effectively pair-minded. It turns the case. 3 reasons. First, testing, clash, and preparation maximize the engagement we have, the app inducing progressive progress, the argument and innovation that makes the case more rigorous. Second is methods. Their interpretation incentivizes debaters to identify harm, not propose a solution, and to evade clash. Competitive debates over methods solves the impacts of the case better. Third is competitive incentives. Debate is not good for solvency because competitive incentives dictate the utility of every argument you make. It distorts and corrupts our solvency. The counter-interpretation. First, it explodes limits. It justifies infinite departure from actor, mechanism, form, or content. Only the resolution is pre-established when it states that all teams know about. Neg prep is centered around alliances in general, but about arguing that USFG should not reduce its alliance commitments. When the app gets to use alliances merely as an analogy, a site for historical analysis, or a brief 30-second connection in a 9-minute 1AC, it zaps all on the ground. Second, it's arbitrary. Their interpretation isn't based on any evidence or interpretation. It's only strategic for them. It justifies any team's interpretation that they come up with, and it's unpredictable. Third, this proves the TV. If they think the resolution is a good jumping off point, then defend topical action as a baseline. 4, turn. It links to all of their offense. It also gatekeeps by forcing teams to tie their advocacy to the resolution when the AF has said they might not want to. 5, they don't meet this. Asia explained the resolution as a minimum threshold for topicality, and AFs should be allowed to do anything above that. The AF doesn't meet that floor because it doesn't reduce American alliance commitment. 6, it solves none of their offense. The resolution is truly just a floor. It means that white teams will never. It means that white teams will never engage in black scholarship. They won't be. Will never engage with black scholarships with black scholarship because they'll just read Baltics or Sinkakis. We didn't concede the Kelsey evidence. Most of this was done on case, but I'll do it here. The potential of the resolution argument. First, what is centering blackness? This is arbitrary. It justifies different interpretations for any group and isn't based on evidence. So far, it just seems like it means that debate should be about blackness, which is clearly solved by reading it on the neg. Second, it requires policing the bounds of blackness. They're conceding our arguments about competitive incentives. Every debater wants to win, and not having to defend a plan makes it easier to do so, even if only debaters who are centering blackness are exempted from reading plans under their model. It bakes in violent identity testing to delineate who is black and who gets to be on topical and incentivizes white debaters to prey on black partners who just want to win. Third, it can weigh the 1AC against topicality. That presumes our ability to negate it, which is moot from the start. The only reason that the case might look like it's more important than topicality is the technique of the flow because it's our inability to answer it. So error negative. The black erasure argument. It's not first no link. Insofar as the link, this argument is inclusion of critical arguments. Good. Our interpretation solves A. Being negative solves it. Incorporates the 1AC content while retaining the process of contestation, ensuring better, more rigorous debates. Second is B. Topical versions of the topical version of the app. It's a litany of ways to include scholarship of blackness within the app. It says USFG should. The apps can explore material about ideological connections between foreign interventions and militarized policing, can utilize things like Agatha Angelo, who theorize IR using Afro-pessimist scholarship. Even their 1AC, which criticizes NATO as being the legacy of Atlantic slave trade, can advocate the U.S. to withdraw. Second turn, they impose a hegemonic definition of blackness by assuming black debaters don't care about foreign policy. Kansas isn't the authoritative voice of what's good for black debaters. This argument is only made strategically. Third, we solve better planet apps, make it more difficult for smaller, more traditional, diverse teams to win debates because it exposes the research burden. That creates more Michigan Cames and Harvard BSs. Four, winning is not key. Don't conflate losing with exclusion. Their model is only sustainable, assuming infinite wins, which is unachievable, and places the judge in an untenable position where voting negative and expression defines. Five, they can't solve debate. It exhibits racism insofar as a microcosm of society, but it can't, and its biases can't be counteracted by arbitrarily deciding that black debaters shouldn't have to be topic of the clash argument. First, the impact to this piece of offense isn't black erasure. They've said that we've committed an active erasure because we ignore other competitive actions in debate. That's not the same thing. Second, the existence of debate practices doesn't make clash impossible. Bad disclosure, new apps, obscure literature are all constrained by the limits of the topic. If new apps were about anything, the neg would be in trouble. It's not the same is not true when the neg knows that the app will be about alliances and defense rights. Third, we're not responsible for those practices. They will continue and might be bad, but it has nothing to do if Northwestern or Kansas should win this debate. Four, in debate, there are features that force the neg to negate if they want the ballot. Each side is assigned an app or a neg, and only one of them can get the W. They also understand a debate is binary because they're trying to get the ballots at the. Okay. The fairness argument, first, procedural fairness is good in a competitive space like debate where one team wins and the other team loses. Any model debate that could attempt to make it anything more than a game will inevitably be co-opted by competitive incentives, which make it the only impact your ballot can have to uphold the game's procedures. A critical procedure is the only thing that separates debate from other academia discussions or modeling. Without it, there is no debate. Second, fairness in debate especially matters during COVID. Their interpretation produces burnout, exacerbates mental health crisis brought on by the pandemic, and explodes negative research burden. We're all here to win, but simultaneously trying to navigate the isolation of an online world. We're in worrying for physical health of ourselves and our family. Three, we're not responsible for defending the general principle of procedural fairness. Generally, the culpability to said, first, limits are good in debate. There are certain features which mean that the dialogue can't be unbounded. There are over 100 teams making different arguments. We only have so much time between tournaments to write arguments and research. If we want, if we want our takes to be nuanced, they have to have depth. Second, don't conflate losing with exclusion. If reading the 1AC is valued and that is more important than getting the ballot, they should be prepared to lose. If losing is exclusion, it's inevitable. No one goes undefeated. Third, turn. They're essentializing our interpretation to an identity. We don't say black debaters are out. They're essentializing black debate to assert that no black debaters can engage with the resolution. Four, that's fine.
Okay, stopped at 3:45. Okay, the order is case, the critique, and then T. Okay,
Sorry, just checking, there's no doc, yeah.
right, yeah. Okay, everyone's good? All right.
Society and academia calls to move to race legacy of slavery, though you're saying black experience resolution, an example of that. And it's ability to write the language or space necessary for black culture, express relationships to anti-blackness. There are two impacts that go conceded. First is erasure. It frames the entirety of the impact debate. Anti-blackness permeates all aspects of black life, unreal commits white members of debate, or the alternative responsibility for black communities holds the power accountable. The after for recuperation without reification, excavation, not legacy refuses to be erased. Second is fungibility. Society is only capable of coherence based on blackness as absence. The result is exhaustion of the affidavit for whence its impact of the origination of alliance requires one static approach. You should refuse their call order in favor of endorsing the abstract of recuperation without reification in the face of clash for initiative heading catastrophe. Don't block out the sirens, don't chase the channel, don't ask Asia for anything, rather surrender to blackness, it's giving Asia the authority and acknowledging all the ways in which white people are indebted to the black people in this community. It's not about absolving guilt, but rather about surrendering your right to have an opinion on issues of anti-blackness. This space should be open and totally interrogating individual relationships. No amount of evidence or technical proficiency can overcome the overarching narrative and theorization of the act. They have not answered, throwing things at the wall without context, or cannot justify a negative ballot. The ontology stuff, blackness is ontological. Now the honest is I'll never respond to the status quo of ongoing violence against black people. Consider their historical counterexamples in the context of the Kenosha terrorists in the past few months. Their explanation can't account for specific symptoms of slavery, like enslaved people being beaten to death or living conditions worth their livestock. We just conceded that. Also, conceded the court decision nation makes the choice. The one doesn't assert that it is impossible blackness to change, but rather that the political is upon black death, and therefore changes occur never truly for the better of black people, but rather for the sake the surrender frames all these arguments in the first place. You should resist the incentive to determine which strategies work for black people. It's not that there's no agency, but they've ignored the Hartman. And it's the bottom of the chart that says even in the face of that legacy, it's possible to resist within captivity, which means we don't need to any of the agency arguments in the first place. The distinction answers of the papering over contingencies could recognize things have changed, but they're still structurally messed up. The surrender argument, it's not about individuals, but rather positionality of blackness and centering that black people can still be anti-black. People would reject people like Hannah so much. It's not just trusting age, but rather interrogating the individual relationship cross-sex proves the link to all of their altruism stuff, because they believe they can resolve all capital boundaries with the same instinct and proves all of the different burdens argument that Asia's making cross-sex critique. Preferred analytic fungibility over labor. Think back to the case to be their fight to grapple with the slavery, even if they win a link argument. Frame the alternative through the cost of labor, investing energy into city structures, ignores ways that activism is the cost for black people that impacted on the case of permutation, extend permutation to both. It solves the gap for winning the analytic fungibility, makes up the prerequisite to comment in capitalism. They're behind level theory, which means the permutation is your best bet. It solves the cost of participation, like parts of groups like childcare, shelter, food. It simply holds, however, they simply hold black people accountable for the accumulations spurred by white people. While black erasures have benefited in internal disaction, the alternative, they all can never excavate the history of anti-blackness within these institutions or debate, which means they can't solve that portion of offense. The desire of evidence from the choice is not answered by name. The system of racial capitalism is co-constitutive. It answers the root cause arguments. Quick work accounts for the historical erasure of systems of violence and understanding of the history. It's a prerequisite to the alternative. There's only risk of erasure, and they can't create the energy that's necessary for the movement in the first place. The evidence is very specific and roots of trade-off. Only the perm creates relationality that's necessary to address the needs of black people, rather than stripping them onto that turns the cake as absence to the account of anti-blackness, exhausts black participants, and forces them out of which replicates fungibility. All the links rely on a separation which material and cultural articulations of blackness. However, the one AC problematizes that distinction in the ways the construction of cultural histories are always impacting the lives of people. The Dean evidence proves that they have an oppositional approach to any form of criticism, totalitarian, which proves all the exclusion often say linked to the micropolitics of arguments, because all debate is micropolitical. Nothing changes, which means it's just about our relationship to debate in the first place. All the wake work prevents focusing on the past was on the case in the first place. Yes, there's that benefit solves the ratio. Yes, we all black people should always get a reputation, or else it makes it much more blames them. Then blame them for the structure of the topic. Dean evidence proves they view their alternate, they view their method perfect, which means they're likely to limit out anyone who rejects that in the first place. Radical leftist movements always require the theory and contributions of black people, but always deny them when it doesn't serve those goals. They all require dictating when and people perform that labor in the first place. It's proven, given that legal explanation that relies on things that aren't the app and proves they don't understand how blackness operates, because it's always demanded. They always demand labor despite their best intentions, which they can't solve, but only increase violence. They also have no answer to the extinction arguments at the bottom of the tree. Doesn't assume different proximities, so definitely white people are able to access from avoiding instinctual black people simply given the privilege of not dying. The collective responsibility just have the negative exceptionalizes necessary for one collectivity, which denies them ways of whiteness as disproportionately attributes the access of capitalism and asserts that because black people died too, they have, or are affected too, they have responsibility for organizing in the first place. The root cause arguments were answered above with the Ziderman evidence, and so was all the exclusion stuff. Schroeder was on the case. T. For because the demonstration of debates consistent in a ratio of blackness to go here itself. If we win, the skills of their interpretation aims to maximize are unethical, then we should win the debate. There's no argument that against the acts winning a dissent firmly, but the impacts outweigh the argument is that you should not endorse model best forever, but rather surrender blackness to defer model best for those at the margins. Our model doesn't exclude theirs, but theirs excludes ours, which means even if debate is a game, it is only so as privileged worldview. The racist black experience counter-interpretation used resolution as jumping off point rather than end all be all solves their options because it includes their model in addition to the idea as a functional permutation which solves all of their weak exclude too. That evidence is that after the space is never delivered of creating space for black scholars within debate orbits of alternative features and understandings of the political to hold creates rather strategies outside of the state and their information necessary and delivered because it denies those the culpability is that every reference to other aspects of the counter-interpretation allows for improves their and limits explosion to snell, which means it's only a question of how they weaponize that in this space in particular. The job of the fairness stuff, you can't simply going for fairness in 2021. All the examples of the Tracy prove the most fair thing to do today is surrender blackness because it's something the valid can remedy fairness creates a burden of exploitably on black debaters that they never have to be because they can rely on concepts like this. The roots of race and blacks within debate legitimize and state lowers the threshold for non-black debaters. The clash up is only took by the prescriptive, descriptive, made above. No one actually clashes the way they talk about. They talk, which means they can't solve this impact. Which I debate is a grammar of the grammar that we critique. Which I realize on dictating when, where, and how the black women should perform the labor. It also means we only call out anti-blacks and half debates, which obviously can't solve topic versus the gap. It's not the gap; it's unpredictable. Rather, it makes them uncomfortable. The TVA proves they are prepared to engage us like ours, but it must be on their terms. Uncomfortable is always weaponized to exclude blackness. The concept that the TVA can't access all or offensively to the ideas of movement to debate itself, which brings high about autonomy. It also links them to the shift. It's at debate so play and how they say to conceive or support the scholarship. We meet our counter-interpretation because it's a response to the resolution, our critique of NATO, and a refusal of the call to order. Yeah.
Okay, we're starting. TK case. Anyone not good? Your ballot maximizes upholding fair competition because debaters are here to win. At no point has the affirmative answered this thesis claim that every argument any debater makes is motivated by their desire to win the debate. Debate has two unique features that are worth preserving: competition and negation. In no other form are we crammed into a virtual room and forced to directly respond to an opposing idea that is motivated by winning. Your ballot should maximize the benefits that we can achieve here as opposed to other places. We can't be here to expand the content of our knowledge because at school we can take whatever classes that we want, and we can't be here for political advocacy because judges decide debates technically, not ethically, and no one assumes your argument is true just because you win it. This is as true for Ice Age as it is for the AF. Every argument that the AF makes, including their desire for you to surrender, is mediated through their desire to win, not altruism. Otherwise, they would be content with reading the 1AC and losing. Premised off of the last exchange of cross-ex, our interpretation solves the best. The topic with the mechanism USFG should is the only stable point available to debaters in pre-tournament preparation and provides clear standards for competition in debates. The terminal impact is burnout. Their interpretation exacerbates mental health crises brought on by COVID. This is dropped by the 1AR. Researching one topic is hard enough, but their interpretation forces an egg to research every possible AF under the given one, plus anything that is tangentially related to the resolution. We're all here to win, but are simultaneously navigating the isolation of an online world and worrying for the physical health of ourselves and our families, which means that you should reduce the burden on debaters. T outweighs the case. One logic. If we're right that the introduction of the AF was unfair, we cannot logically be held to the standard of negating it, even if they seem ahead on any part of the debate technique, have a neg bias. 2, internal link. Compare solvency, not terminal impact. Fairness is the only impact that the ballot can solve. 3rd, debate cannot be a site for survival strategies because competitive incentives mean that it's always tied to the ballot, and your ability to survive or have a strategy to exist within debate cannot be tied to the necessity for winning. Okay, first piece of offense is erasure of blackness. Our counter interpretation solves in a couple of ways. They didn't respond to any of the particular examples in the 2NC, specifically that the 1NR, specifically the 1AC says critiques NATO as being a legacy of the Atlantic slave trade. That is extremely compatible with a strategy that advocates that the USFG should withdraw, which means there's no link to exclusion of black scholarship. The 1AR does not say why our interpretation is exclusionary. If their argument is just you can't exclude anything any black debater wants to do, then it's just that you can't exclude anything that any black debater wants to do. This links to all of our arguments about racial determinism and political strategies, and then why it's bad to our political strategies. They also concede that they don't solve any of these things because debate exhibits racism only insofar as it is a microcosm of society. All the examples the 1AC cross-ex gives, like debate polices the arguments of black debaters not just because of topicality, because of tab staff coming to rooms, is not something that reading a plan actively enforces onto people, and it is not something that voting affirmative solves. Our skills are not unethical, they are neutral. Skills in debate teach you how to refine your proposals, how to negate them when they're at their best, and then for strategy adaptation in a world of distorted information, the ability to comparatively evaluate a course of action, revise your opinions upon learning new information, and engage in productive dialogue is paramount, and is something that the AF shuts out by immediately saying that any attempt to negate the 1AC is akin to policing it or to attaching to their labor. Now, the main point of offense in the 2AR, surrendering to blackness, reject it. The 1AR concedes an extensive disad to this model of viewing interpersonal interactions. The AF encourages a model of white altruism, which turns the case and turns all of their arguments about debate because it trades off with structural challenges to racism. The 1AC says that you should, at an individual level, recognize your position in this debate and surrender your position, but that introduces a white allyship model where all white allies can do is shut up and defer completely, which our Peterson-Smith evidence says completely undergirds and or completely distorts our understanding of racism as a structural system which does not reside in the individual choices of people on an individual level and combats or prevents combating it completely. Structural or competitive incentives also dictate how you view all of this offense. The counter-interpretation, this shadow extended in the 1AR does not respond to any of our offense. They've conceded that if anything, it proves the TVA because it proves the resolution is compatible with reading the 1AC. They conceded they don't meet it because the resolution is a floor, but the AF doesn't meet that floor, that it's arbitrary, it's not based on any evidence, it explodes limits, etc. This is not enough to go for this. It also links to all of their arguments because it says that everyone has to relate to the resolution in some way. The culpability DA, they've conceded that our interpretation is better for small schools and better for fairness. Their interpretation is not more black success. It results in more Michigan KMs. If anything, there's also a structural versus procedural difference for fairness. Think back to the 1AC cross-ex when when I ask what makes debate exclusionary, again, they don't say reading plans or T, but just checking up on Black debaters, which their interpretation doesn't solve. They also care about fairness. Read the last question of 1EC cross-ex. We do solve clash and fairness in this debate. Voting negative rectifies the fact that we didn't have anything to say the 1EC or couldn't predict it under the topic. Our internal links are also above, and our interpretation is best. Switch side debate is not bad. Why? It teaches us to refine proposals. Their refusal to engage leads to dogma and echo chambers. TVA is not a shift DA. We don't have to solve all of their offense. It just proves no exclusion. They don't meet. They're not a response to the resolution because meeting is a yes/no question. Either they were engaged or have the USFG withdraw its defense packs. Their answer to the counterplan proves that they don't do that. The K is not a separate reason to vote affirmative. One, this would prove all of our arguments about them shutting out engagement. That is the worst mode of political engagement imaginable. If the NEG cannot make any argument saying the AF was bad without immediately saying that that is coercive of their labor, then it makes it impossible to engage with political arguments, and it results in endorsing the political commission's positions of people like Candace Owens. We didn't intend to coerce them on an interpersonal level, and anything in the 2 hour would be new. The case debate, most of the stuff about surrender to blackness answers this because it's now extra offense against the K, but none of their ontology arguments are separate reasons to vote affirmative because it's not a reason to reject our framework. Their erasure arguments do not apply because the topic isn't erasure via NAR arguments about why you can incorporate Black scholarship into a reading of the topic. Fungibility, the AF doesn't solve it, our turn outweighs it, and surrender makes blackness more fungible by making it seem like it's something that you can resolve on an interpersonal, or making it seem like it's something that you can resolve on an interpersonal level, which is not how structural relationships of racism work, and is a DA to their entire method, their only offense against T, and anything the 2AR could go for that the 1AR does not grapple with.
Okay, is everyone good? Okay, it's gonna be case and framework. After the two and I don't know what their offense is because they've conceded that the counter interpretation is a permutation RF plus their method, but I'm going for the surrender to blackness and the double standard arguments that they've also conceded as a list for how you should sift through the rest of the offense. Surrender to blackness is not a tokenization or an assuasion of like guilt or blame listening to Candace Owens, but rather all of their arguments don't assume the specific instruction that I gave you all. It's not just surrender to blackness and that's it, but it also means for the three of you acknowledging all the ways in which you're indebted to black people in this community, but also an acknowledgement of the history or in the history of framework in and of itself because it was a response to the Louisville Project, et cetera, all of the ways in which their offense exists because of black innovation, et cetera. It isn't about absolving yourself, but rather about surrendering your right to have an opinion on what model is most fair because that assertion ignores everyone's relationship to the topic in this space is different, which is a similar offense they try to go for when they try to assert that COVID affects the way that people are able to do different debate prep. I want you to remember the violent double standard argument next from the 2AC and the cracks of the 2NC when they have conceded that voting deck doesn't result in movements or even the creation of their model, which is all the work I'll do in the clash debate. They tell you that our argument is about debate. Our argument is about the ways in which debate has become a space where the threshold for advocacy and activist skills have all been drastically lower. Why people get up and say, let's start a movement, or, well, I feel it, my plan is a good idea, and that should somehow be enough and expect to be rewarded for it, because historically they happen when none of that shit is fucking enough, which means that you voting negative for a model that has not or never will fucking exist is also a form of white altruism that sort of forms your preference or what you think is a better model for other black people over me, which is all an example of that sort of erasure because it ignores what black people have fucking been telling you since the Louisville Project and even before that about what it makes debate fucking racist, which leads me to the black erasure impact. It will shape the rest of the debate. Anti-blackness permeates any of everything that niggas do. Debate and alliances are one of the attempt in that day. Expect unwavering commitment and compliance, giving us nothing in return. It misprioritizes blackness and its role in creating relationality. The app and the poem at the top of the 1AC and the 2EC is an impact turn. So the resolution's understanding of the alliances being something understood is worthy of attention because the ways in which it requires blackness to constantly prove its sort of ontology or proximity to death or its worthiness to be in debate, because we ourselves have also already gone for a burnout argument which superseded and already exists in debate, not because of COVID, but because we people are fucking racist, which leads me to the framework debate proper, the counter interpretation. We should understand the resolution as a jumping off point rather than an endpoint. Ross did say that we meet our interpretation because we understand we responded to the resolution in the ways in which the prioritization of NATO in and of itself in response to everything that's happening in the status quo is an act of erasure, etc. The Kelsey evidence begs the question of control and how we come to terms with the burdens and implications and what the implications of those burdens that you've chosen have and will be. It's our app plus your answer. We think it's valuable and it's the most realistic understanding of debate as is. It maximizes the deliberative potential of the resolution and centers blackness. It's the net benefit, creating space for black scholars to understand different features that move away from Eurocentric notions that the history is good. They have no external impact to their framework model because they've conceded or clashed in fairness arguments about the ways in which voting negative does not change the way that people debate. It doesn't change people debate. It doesn't change whether or not K-teens read critical affirmatives. It doesn't change the fact that policy debaters are still going to read policy apps. I don't think any K person or the existence of reading a non-topical affirmative would ever have resulted in Dan Bannister reading a fucking K app or doing whatever the fuck he wanted. It means that you all will still debate how you fucking want to debate regardless of this debate or the existence of the app in and of itself. But we have the net benefit of centering blackness in discussions like these because you conceded all the other things. It's not about framework. It's like you do things because you think it's the most competitive. But the reason that I do things is because it's the only thing that makes it being in the space unnecessarily survival for me. Debate in its relationship to erasure on the academic and interpersonal level also demonstrated dispatch to their model because it greenlights a world where debate becomes isolated from the spaces, which all the things I do above the burnout stuff. I already said that we meet our counter-interpretation and all of those arguments are necessarily not unique because of the racist nature of debate in and of itself. The survival strategy stuff is good because it allows for more black people to exist here and for new ideas which are necessarily good. That leads me to the TVA stuff. I'll do that next. They've conceded most of the offense against the TVA from the 1A. The app is not only a reduction in the ideational commitments to NATO, but also debate in the resolution forcing the absolute plan makes it impossible to access normative critique rumors and debates as a whole. It solves none of the affirmative. It's just about the introduction of black scholarship, but the literal presencing of black debaters within the space is necessary for endurance. The counter-interpretation, seeing the resolution as a jumping off rather than an endpoint, is not necessarily saying that the resolution is good, but rather a recognition of the most realistic understanding of debate. Debates on the TVA would never engage with the debate portion of the method of the affirmative, which is bad. It exemplifies the prescriptive versus descriptive nature of debate, which is all the stuff I do above. The switch side debate stuff process, which that is literally the grammar debate of the one secret that demands where, when, and how Black women perform in their labor in order to satisfy others' ability to engage. I don't give a fuck. They've conceded. The reading of the Rebuttal on the app is a central component of challenging grammars of debate that have support anti-Blackness doing it. On the negative, doesn't access any performative aspect of the 1AC, etc. The case arguments that they try to go for don't fucking matter because all their best offense was on all the critique which they said they're not going for. I already did the survival strategy is necessarily good because it means more Black people can exist in this space, which also begs the question of their forwarding of their model and for whom when they say that that exclusion is necessarily good or that survival strategies in the debate are not bad. This argument about how the argument about how racism cannot be resolved on an interpersonal level is the most idiotic thing that I've ever heard, because obviously racism can be enacted or anti-Blackness can be enacted on interpersonal level. Starting from that and understanding that we can resolve interpersonal violence within debates are good, but rather you saying that we should make it about a very large plan that literally the space is so removed from is idiotic because it doesn't reach the level of what you can say. So white people get up and say, well, I had a good plan, or I talked about Black people in like XO country that I have no relationship to. Doesn't that make me a good person? No, but that's why debate is so fucking toxic. The counter-interpretation stuff, it's not shadow extended, which is all the counter-interpretation things I do above it. Also, this also solves all their offense, but it acknowledges the fact that they have none. The culpability stuff in the small schools, this that K's and non-topical apps are the best thing for small schools. Emporia and Johnson County are all examples. It's what allowed Black people to catch up and even the playing field against their schools who weaponize policy arguments against Black people, etc. And are all more examples, accurate examples of history, which is also why the app is good because it allows a more accurate telling of history and debate and its relationship to anti-Blackness, etc. Yes, in the cross-section of the 1AC, I said framework and T are also a part of that, but said it's not the only determinant factors. I don't know what Nina is talking about there, though. Yeah.
Good debate, y'all.
Yes, good debate.
Would judges be okay if I stream the RFDs?
Sure.
Yep, that's fine.
Hey, y'all, we have a decision. Is that everyone? Okay, congratulations to both sides. Excellent debate. Decisions of 2-1 for the AF from Kansas.
Okay, yep, I was on the sat. Yes, congratulations to both teams. All right, so I'll be brief. I think the negative is able to win a top line argument that frames debate as a space that's uniquely reliant on competition and, more importantly, negation. I think they're winning that their interpretation is better because the counter interpretation is bad for limits. I buy their spin on that. I think they access their burnout impacts. As well as their arguments that the T comes before the case. I'll say a couple quick things about the case and then get to T. Obviously, I think the AF is winning their erasure impact pretty well. It's a little less clear how well the AF is able to solve the fungibility impact to me. I'm not sure how surrendering to blackness as it's formulated here or other parts of the AF like excavating the oppressive history of NATO or anagrammical resistance, how those address being acted upon for the maintenance of civil society. So not a huge deal, but and maybe just something to think about explaining better in later rounds. But that was one thing I thought. I also think the neg is winning a small impact on their arguments about white altruism. So the Tuasi's articulation of surrendering to blackness is that it's acknowledging the ways you're indebted to black people in the community and white people surrendering their right to have an opinion on what model is most fair or best. And as you say, the AF is not about absolving yourself, but ignoring your own opinions. The reason why I think the neg is winning an argument here is the Peterson, Smith, and Bean evidence. It's okay, but it does have a couple lines I think are germane about how the impact of an argument to shut up and listen is that it limits the struggle to interpersonal interactions and can downplay the structures of power that produce racism, and that this has a distorting effect on our understanding of racism. Now, yes, as KU points out, racism can and does happen on an interpersonal level, and making debate plan focus doesn't solve that. But those arguments to me do not address whether the effect of surrendering or shutting up lead people to presume that a racism arises from interpersonal versus structural factors. So I think there's a small risk of an impact here, but that's not the main part of my decision. On T, I think, like I've said, neg is winning that this is a uniquely competitive activity. And Nina's argument about how negation is center is not answered well in my mind. I really need a way to understand and prioritize the role for the negative in maximizing the value of debate specifically. I think they're winning that limits are key to small schools. I thought that was a little new in the 2AR. Maybe I missed that elsewhere. And it's always kind of funny hearing that as a T argument. But I'm also persuaded that the AF's counterinterpretation is blowing out the limits. I need to hear more explanation for what criteria would be used under this interpretation to limit out AFs that are okay, because otherwise I'm persuaded that by the COVID burnout impact. And I also kind of by the argument that is pointed out in the 2NR that how exactly is it the AF is able to address round external racism, like the issues brought up with TAB, for example. And then lastly, a couple quick stray thoughts. I thought some things the AF might do to put themselves in a better position, in my mind at least, was why the debate skills that the negatives interpretation incentivizes are bad in themselves. Or extending the argument that limits are inevitable. Maybe that was in the 2AR and I just missed it, but I didn't have it flagged. Alternatively, maybe the AF could pivot to different parts in the AF, like it's seen it as a genealogy via the Trilliot evidence or Hartman and Black Anarchy, stuff like that. But yeah, it was basically, I bought the arguments about limits.
I can go next. I thought this was a very strange debate because it was so late breaking, and I sort of thought both sides were missing some sort of standard pieces. I ultimately thought that any possibility or any chance that voting affirms a more ethical model or view of debate outweighs the impacts of the negatives going for. I guess one place that I differ substantially from Chris is this kind of burnout mental health impact in the 1R and 2R really didn't resonate with me for the reason that the 2AR cites, which is that this burnout argument is something explicitly claimed by the 1AC, and it's made even in the context of the pandemic, but it, it's about the unique ways that Black people have to deal with all of those overlapping problems and with that with burnout itself. And so that, I don't know, that just, it didn't hit with me. So it's really hard for me to kind of look at them and say the burnout engendered by limits explosion, which, I think is something that you're winning, that impact still outweighs kind of the anti-Blackness impacts. I just thought that was kind of a counterproductive place for the impact argument to go, and I thought that was the best sort of terminal impact explanation at least the clearest and most explicit terminal impact explanation in the 2NR. The question, I think, of ballot solvency is a little bit flipped for me in this debate to how it often plays out. I thought that the AF was very consistent on voting neg does not actualize a particular model or produce the debates that you would want to have happen in the neg. Does say, you have kind of a line on the ballot can only solve fairness, but without kind of the traditional deeper explanation for why that's the case, or why it is the case that voting affirmative does not solve the AF impacts. Now, I do think you have some arguments against, the AF's mechanism that I'll get to in a second. But I didn't think that it was, I didn't think basically that you won, that what the ballot determines is only, procedural fairness or not. The AF's characterization of their interpretation as like a permutation is probably nonsense, but I definitely have it in the 1AR, and I don't have the 2NR kind of pushing back on it very much. You do, debate their counter interpretation for sure, but I don't think the sort of our model includes yours, but your model doesn't include ours characterization is disputed. And that, that also loomed pretty large for me. The topical version and switch side debate arguments, I think, are, there and could be fleshed out more deeply. I think that the argument that they're making about dictating how and when Black people make particular arguments sort of deals with this. Now, I did come very close to voting on the surrendering bad arguments. I thought that was a place where the neg was pretty good and the AF was comparatively not great, but I think that the AF is doing an okay job winning, that their interpretation of what this means is not the reductive version that means, or really the version that is offensive for the neg, that is listening to people like Candace Owen or always perpetually deferring, but is a guide for listening to Black people in debate specifically, and what we are being told by Black people through what is characterized as history of debate. And I do think this amounts to a solvency takeout or reduction for the F sort of mechanism or solvency, but I don't think it is a complete takeout, because I think that there, that a strength of the F throughout the debate is kind of, here is how you should think about this debate, how you should think about debate itself. The 1AC is sort of set up to say debate is anti-Black, and so I think a lot of this debate for me comes down to reconciling, if debate is a game, but debate is also an anti-Black game, how do we align ourselves within that? And I thought that the AF was ahead on sort of judge instruction on how to do that. So I thought they won kind of their vision to be a little bit better than one that I, fairly typically do align myself with.
Okay, I guess I'm last. The short of it is that I voted AF to surrender to Blackness because voting negative doesn't create an idealized vision of debate that solves their impacts, but voting AF does say that the AF does not have to labor to be topical, which requires discussing alliances, which requires historical erasure. I agree with quite a lot of what Michaela had said. I think that for me, I also think maybe the permutation counterterp is a bit silly, but I think it provides like some relative defense. At least it includes that some teams don't have to read KAFs, which maybe is something. But I think that this matters not as much to me. I think the larger issue is that I have the 1AR in 3 different places saying that voting neg does not create their model that resolves their impacts. And I think the 2NR's best answer to this possibly is, but it does rectify the fairness that happens in this round, which I think means that it short circuits your ability to leverage the burnout offense or the small schools offense, or internally turns to the AF's pedagogy relative, which means I think the threshold for voting AF becomes quite a bit lower. I also think just the AF, the 2AR versus 2NR, the AF is just ahead on impact calculus. They're sort of subsuming the burnout argument, which I think Michaela already talked about, so I don't want to rehash. The surrender to blackness, I saw this quite a bit differently. I actually thought the neg was decently behind here. I think that the 2AC and to some extent the 1AR, and also in the 2AR, are doing a decent job differentiating white altruism from what they're describing as surrender to blackness. But I think the more offensive portion to me is that the extent to which the AF is advocating a white altruistic politics, the neg links as much, if not harder, which is their entire double standard argument that voting negative does not generate a movement, it does not generate a framework model that resolves these things. So either way, I think I'm being told I'm voting to presumably help black people more or less. But the tiebreaker for the AF for me is that I'm constantly being told, well, if you're uncertain, you should not tell black people what the ideal model of debate is. Because I think the 2NR is sort of conceding this question that even if debate is competitive, it's intrinsically micropolitical and therefore interpersonal. I thought that the AF could do a bit more offense in the fungibility stuff you had earlier in the debate by the end. So I also kind of had struggled with what does the AF need to solve to get your impacts. And ultimately, I just think like you not having to be topical is fine because I think there's relatively low risk of the neg impacts and high risk of the AF impacts and so on and so forth. But I think you could be like holding us accountable for Michigan KM and what white people do is like racist. And like that's just an independent reason you have performatively done. So that I don't have to mix like solvency with your T offense, if that makes sense. Yeah, that's the short of my decision.
I think my one question is, Michaela, it seemed like you were closer to voting neg and it was maybe like a 2NR pieces choosing what impact to go for kind of thing.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so do you think like, I mean, it's obviously not as simple as just like